A classified op gone fatally wrong. 8 elite Navy SEALs pinned deep inside a sheer granite gorge. Ammo decimated. Medevac impossible. When the enemy closed in for the final slaughter, salvation didn't come from a rescue chopper. It came from a 30mm rotary cannon, tearing the sky in half. Sweat stung Lieutenant Sarah Hayes's eyes, but she didn't dare blink. Through the magnified optic of her HK 416 assault rifle, the jagged ridgeline of the Shamal Valley looked deceptively peaceful. The oppressive midday sun baked the shale and sandstone, sending shimmering heat waves rising into the dead, windless air. Hayes was a pioneer, though she despised the word. She hadn't endured the grueling, bone-snapping agony of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training to be a poster child or a headline. She had broken the ultimate glass ceiling in naval special warfare simply because she was born to fight, born to lead, and born to operate in the darkest, most unforgiving corners of the globe. Her presence in SEAL Team 6's elite Alpha Squadron had initially been met with quiet skepticism, but under the blistering heat of a dozen combat deployments, she had forged a reputation of absolute, unyielding iron. She was their officer, their brother in arms, and the sharpest tactical mind in the unit. But right now, all her tactical brilliance was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. "Hold up," Hayes whispered into her boom mic. Her voice was calm, a stark contrast to the sudden, icy dread coiling in her gut. Behind her, the 7 men of her element halted instantly, dissolving into the rocky shadows. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Wyatt, a grizzled veteran with a scar running from his jaw to his collarbone, crouched low, his eyes scanning the left flank. Further back, Private First Class Jeremy Cole, an Army Ranger attached to their unit for specialized route clearance, knelt behind an outcropping, his heavy pack settling into the dirt. They were deep behind enemy lines on Operation Broken Crown, tasked with capturing a high-value insurgent bomb maker who had been supplying devastating, improvised explosive devices across the region. Intelligence had promised a lightly guarded compound at the valley floor. Instead, they had found a ghost town. The target was gone, the compound abandoned, the ashes in the fire pit cold. "I don't like this, LT," Wyatt muttered over the encrypted channel, his rifle trained on a cluster of boulders 100 yards up the slope. Not a single goat herder in 5 miles. No birds. No insects. The valley is holding its breath. "Because it's waiting for us to exhale," Hayes replied, her mind racing through the topographical map she had memorized. They were moving through a dry riverbed, flanked by steep, ancient granite walls that offered terrifyingly few avenues of escape. The crack of a high-caliber sniper rifle shattered the silence before she could issue the order to fall back. The sound hadn't even fully registered when the rock face inches from Hayes's head exploded into razor-sharp shrapnel. She threw herself sideways, tackling Chief Wyatt into the dirt, just as the deafening, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a DSHK heavy machine gun erupted from the high ground. "Contact! Right flank! Elevated!" Hayes roared, spitting dust from her mouth. The ambush was perfectly executed. The enemy hadn't just anticipated their arrival, they had funneled the SEALs into a meticulously prepared killbox. From concealed caves and fortified bunkers carved into the upper cliffs, a relentless torrent of lead poured down on the 8 Americans. Green tracers crisscrossed the narrow riverbed, tearing through the scrub brush and shattering the sparse cover. "Brooks is hit," yelled Specialist Aaron Wright, dragging the squad's radio man behind a pulverized stone pillar. Corporal David Brooks was clutching his thigh, bright arterial blood rapidly soaking through his desert fatigues. "Cole, suppressive fire! Ford, get a tourniquet on him!" Hayes commanded, popping up from behind her rock to unleash a controlled 3-round burst into the muzzle flash on the eastern ridge. She heard the satisfying scream of an insurgent tumbling from his perch, but it was a drop in the ocean. There weren't a dozen fighters up there. There were over 100. The air was thick with the acrid stench of cordite and pulverized stone. RPGs began raining down, the concussive shock waves rattling Hayes's teeth and sending geysers of dirt into the sky. They were trapped in a classic L-shaped ambush, and the enemy was slowly closing the jaws. "We can't hold this position," Wyatt shouted over the deafening roar of incoming fire. "They've got us zeroed!" Hayes's eyes darted across the brutal landscape. There was only one way out of the immediate crossfire. Half a mile down the riverbed, the canyon walls pinched together into a deep, narrow fissure, known to the locals as the Devil's Throat. It was a geographical dead end, a blind ravine with sheer walls stretching 900 feet into the sky. It offered complete protection from the elevated crossfire, but it also meant boxing themselves in with no exit. "We're moving to the ravine. Fall back by twos," she ordered. "Wyatt, you're with me. We hold the rear. Ford, get Brooks up and moving." What followed was 20 minutes of pure, unadulterated hell. The SEALs fought their way backward, executing bounding overwatch with textbook precision. Hayes fired until her barrel smoked, covering her men as they dragged the wounded Brooks through the gauntlet. Private First Class Cole took a grazing round to the shoulder, but ignored the blood pouring down his arm, laying down a punishing wall of fire with his M249 SAW. When they finally threw themselves into the shadowed, claustrophobic safety of the Devil's Throat, they were battered, blooded, and nearly out of ammunition. The massive granite walls of the ravine blocked out the sun, plunging them into a cool, ominous twilight. They were out of the crossfire, but as the heavy thud of insurgent boots began echoing at the mouth of the canyon, Hayes realized the grim truth. They hadn't escaped the trap. They had simply walked into its deepest, darkest corner. The Canyon of Death, as the men immediately dubbed it, was a geological nightmare. It was barely 40 feet wide at its base, flanked by vertical, smooth stone walls that leaned inward as they rose, creating a narrow slit of blue sky nearly 1,000 feet above. It was a natural fortress, but also a perfect tomb. Hayes knelt beside Corporal Brooks. His face was chalky, his breathing shallow. Ford had managed to stop the bleeding with a second tourniquet, but Brooks was going into hypovolemic shock. They needed a medical evacuation an hour ago, but getting a Black Hawk helicopter into this narrow gorge was a physical impossibility. "Ammo check," Hayes demanded, wiping a smear of Brooks's blood from her tactical gloves. The reports that came back were chilling. Wyatt had 2 magazines left. Cole was down to his last belt for the saw. Hayes had 30 rounds. Against an enemy force that was currently regrouping at the mouth of the ravine, preparing to swarm them, they wouldn't last 10 minutes. To make matters worse, the enemy had realized the SEALs were boxed in. Insurgents began appearing at the very top edges of the canyon, mere silhouettes against the sky, laughing and dropping fragmentation grenades. The explosions echoed down the walls, sending lethal showers of rock raining onto the trapped operators. "LT, the radio is a brick," Specialist Wright said, frantically twisting the dials on the PRC-117G manpack. "The rock walls are too thick, and the canyon geometry is blocking the satellite uplink. I can't reach the command center. We are completely blacked out." Hayes looked at her men. These were the deadliest warriors on the planet, men who had faced death 12 times over. But in the gloom of the ravine, she saw the quiet, grim acceptance in their eyes. They were SEALs. They would fight to the last bullet, fix bayonets, and take as many of the enemy with them as possible. But they knew this was the end. "Give me the handset," Hayes said, her voice betraying none of the desperation threatening to consume her. Before she was a Navy SEAL, before she had shocked the military establishment by earning her trident, Sarah Hayes had been an Air Force captain. She hadn't just flown planes, she had flown the A-10 Sea Thunderbolt II, the legendary Warthog. She knew the intricacies of close air support, radio wave propagation, and line-of-sight communications better than anyone on the ground. She quickly unspooled the radio's antenna wire, tying it to a piton. "Cole, you've got the best arm. Throw this as high up that rock shelf as you can. We need to clear the immediate interference zone." Cole gritted his teeth against the pain in his shoulder and hurled the weighted wire up the rock face. It caught on a jagged outcropping 50 feet above. Hayes bypassed the standard satellite encryption and switched to a UHF guard frequency, pushing the radio's power output to the absolute maximum. "Any Allied aircraft on this net? This is Voodoo 1 Actual, declaring a broken arrow. We are pinned down. Multiple casualties. Danger close. Does anyone copy?" Static. Above them, another grenade detonated, showering them with dust. Wyatt racked the bolt of his rifle. "They're massing at the entrance, boss. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they rush us." "Any Allied aircraft?" Hayes repeated, her voice turning hard, commanding the ether to respond. "This is Voodoo 1 Actual. Acknowledge." Through the heavy static, a distorted, drawling voice broke through. "Voodoo 1. Actual, this is Boar 2-6. I hear you faint and broken. Passing overhead, Angels 20. I am bingo fuel, returning to base. What is your situation? Over." Hayes felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. Boar, that was an A-10 call sign. Out of all the fast movers and high-altitude bombers in the theater, the only aircraft close enough to hear her desperate UHF hail was the exact machine built for this brutal, dirty work. Boar 2-6, we are 8 dismounted friendlies trapped in a blind ravine. Enemy force of 100 plus preparing to overrun our position. We need immediate close air support. Copy Voodoo, stand by, pushing sensor feed. There was a tense pause. Voodoo, I have your coordinates, but you are inside a geological crack. The walls are 900 feet high and overhang your position. Standard strafing vectors are mathematically impossible. If I dive into that canyon, I won't have the turning radius to pull out. I'll slam into the canyon floor. The pilot was right. To hit the insurgents massing at the entrance, the A-10 would have to fly down inside the canyon. A jet moving at 300 knots cannot instantly pull up to avoid a solid wall of rock. It was a suicide run. "Who is the pilot?" Hayes demanded over the net. "What's your name, Captain?" "This is Captain Jonathan Henderson. Look, Voodoo, I can drop JDAMs on the ridgeline, but I can't get down to the mouth of the ravine where your enemy is massing." Hayes's eyes widened. She knew Jonathan Henderson. 5 years ago, he had been her wingman at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. He was flying her old bird. Tail number 8, 1-0964. "Johnny, listen to me very carefully," Hayes spoke into the handset, dropping all radio protocol. "This is Sarah Hayes. Wraith." Silence on the radio, then a sharp intake of breath. "Sarah, I thought you transferred to the Squids. You're the JTAC down there?" "I'm the SEAL commander down here, Johnny. And if you don't come down into this ditch right now, my boys and I are coming home in boxers." "Sarah, you know the physics. The wingspan won't clear the upper narrows if I bank, and if I dive straight in, I'll pancake into the rock face before my nose comes up." "I know the physics, and I know that airframe," Hayes barked, staring down the canyon as the first wave of insurgents appeared at the entrance, screaming war cries. "You don't bank and you don't pull up. You come in at a 45-degree dive. When you hit the firing solution, you drop your air brakes to 100%, stall the aircraft, and rudder yaw the nose." You let gravity drop the tail, fire the gun as you fall, and use the recoil of the 30mm to push the nose back up before you hit the deck. It was a theoretical maneuver, something pilots joked about in the officers' club after 3 beers, a deliberate, catastrophic stall in a confined space, using the immense 10,000-pound recoil force of the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon to stall-turn the aircraft. If his timing was off by a fraction of a second, the A-10 would obliterate itself against the canyon floor. "We are 10 seconds from being overrun," Hayes yelled over the deafening gunfire as Wyatt and Cole opened up on the advancing insurgents. "Do it, Johnny! Bring her down!" The radio crackled. "May God have mercy on my crew chief for what I'm about to do to this airframe. Keep your heads down, Wraith. I'm rolling in." The sky above the Devil's Throat seemed to darken, though the sun had not moved. It was a psychological shadow, an oppressive weight that fell over the canyon as the distinct, high-pitched whine of twin General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines echoed through the granite corridor. It sounded like a massive piece of canvas being ripped apart from the heavens. Down in the dirt, Chief Wyatt's rifle clicked empty. He didn't swear. He didn't panic. He simply dropped the useless weapon, unsheathed his combat knife, and planted his boots firmly in the shale. Specialist Ford drew his sidearm, standing over the bleeding form of Corporal Brooks. The insurgents were 30 yards away, a screaming tide of fanaticism pouring into the narrow choke point, firing wildly from the hip. "Get down! Bury your faces in the dirt!" Hayes screamed, her voice cracking. "Cover your ears and open your mouths." She knew the overpressure of what was coming. The GAU-8/A Avenger wasn't just a machine gun, it was a 20-foot-long, hydraulic-driven mechanical monster built to shred Soviet tanks. Fired inside a confined geological tube, the acoustic shockwave alone could burst eardrums and cause concussions. High above, Captain Jonathan Henderson inverted his A-10C Thunderbolt II. Hanging upside down in his harness, he stared down into the terrifying black fissure of the Canyon of Death. His altimeter was unwinding at a sickening speed. The titanium bathtub surrounding his cockpit rattled violently as he pushed the nose down into a 45-degree dive directly into the abyss. The jagged rock walls rushed up to meet him, filling his entire canopy. The margins of error were non-existent. If his wingspan deviated by a few feet, he would shear his wings off and incinerate himself. The canyon walls were so tight that the A-10's shadow merged completely with the aircraft. "Come on, old girl," Henderson gritted out beneath his oxygen mask, his eyes glued to the heads-up display. He waited until the absolute last millisecond, watching the target box frame the horde of insurgents massing at the canyon mouth. 300 feet. He was below the canyon rim. 200 feet. The ground was a rapidly expanding blur of brown and grey. "Air brakes full!" Henderson roared to himself. He slammed the throttle back and deployed the Deceleron speed brakes to their maximum span. The A-10 shuddered violently, screaming in aerodynamic agony as it was forced into a deliberate, catastrophic stall. The nose dipped aggressively, gravity taking hold of the 30,000-pound aircraft as it fell like a stone toward the canyon floor. He kicked the rudder hard left, yawing the nose just enough to align the massive rotary cannon with the length of the canyon mouth. Then he pulled the trigger to the second detent. To the SEALs on the ground, it didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like the fabric of reality tearing apart, a deep, resonant, vibrating brrrt that shook the dust from the canyon walls and vibrated the marrow in their bones. A torrent of depleted uranium armor-piercing, incendiary rounds, firing at a staggering rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, slammed into the canyon mouth. The ground simply erupted. It was a localized apocalypse. Granite shattered into plasma. The advancing insurgent line vanished instantly, completely vaporized in a churning, blinding wall of fire, smoke, and pulverized rock. Inside the cockpit, Henderson was fighting for his life. The sheer 10,000-pound recoil force of the GAU-8 fired in a stall condition acted like a rocket thruster, pushing backward and downward on the nose. Just as Hayes had calculated, the violent kinetic push of the gun shoved the nose of the stalling A-10 violently upward. "Pull, pull, pull!" Henderson strained, hauling back on the flight stick with every ounce of his strength. The engines screamed, desperately trying to bite into the dead air and regain lift. The belly of the A-10 scraped the top of the scrub brush. The heat from the incendiary rounds singed the paint on the underside of the fuselage. For a heart-stopping second, the massive jet seemed suspended in mid-air, hanging on a prayer and the thrust of its engines. Then, the wings caught. The aircraft lurched upward, initiating a brutal, near-vertical climb straight up the back wall of the canyon. Down below, the SEALs watched in stunned silence as the titanium beast roared directly over their heads, so close they could smell the raw, unburnt jet fuel and the metallic tang of the cannon fire. "He did it!" Specialist Wright breathed, staring up through the dust. The crazy son of a bitch actually did it. But the victory was horrifyingly short-lived, as Henderson pushed the A-10 into a maximum G climb to clear the upper lip of the canyon. The turbulent crosswinds howling over the ridge caught his right wing. The aircraft, already bleeding airspeed from the stall recovery, snapped violently to the side. Crack! A sickening metallic crunch echoed down the canyon. The right horizontal stabilizer of the A-10 clipped a jagged outcrop of solid granite. The impact instantly sheared off a massive section of the tail, sending a shower of aluminum and hydraulic fluid raining down into the gorge. Henderson's voice crackled over the radio, calm but laced with finality. "Voodoo 1 actual. This is Bore 26. I have suffered catastrophic structural failure. Flight controls are completely unresponsive. I am in an unrecoverable flat spin. Ejecting, I repeat, I am punching out." Hayes watched in horror as the canopy of the A-10 blew off in a flash of pyrotechnics, followed immediately by the rocket motor of the Ace's 2 ejection seat. Henderson shot into the sky just as the crippled warthog crested the ridge, disappearing from view before a massive, earth-shaking fireball erupted on the plateau above. Henderson's parachute deployed, a stark white blossom against the blue sky. But he wasn't drifting toward the safety of the open valley. The intense thermal updrafts generated by his own aircraft's wreckage caught his canopy, dragging him violently backward, right toward the edge of the canyon of death. "No, no, no," Hayes muttered, tracking his descent. The parachute snagged on the razor-sharp rocks at the very lip of the canyon. Henderson slammed hard against the vertical granite face, dangling helplessly like a puppet on a string 300 feet above the canyon floor. The immediate threat of the insurgent ground assault had been entirely annihilated by the A-10's devastating gun run. The mouth of the canyon of death was reduced to a smoldering, silent crater of scorched earth. However, a new and far more terrifying reality immediately took its place. "He's stuck on the upper shelf, LT," Chief Wyatt pointed upward, his eyes squinting against the harsh sun that was finally creeping past the jagged canyon rim. "He's bleeding. I can see it on his flight suit." Lieutenant Sarah Hayes stared up at the sheer rock face. Captain Jonathan Henderson was suspended awkwardly in his parachute harness, groggy and battered, completely exposed against the cliff. Worse, the surviving insurgents from the upper cave complexes, those who had been dropping fragmentation grenades earlier, were mobilizing. Across the upper ridge, Hayes could hear the distinct, aggressive shouting of enemy fighters maneuvering toward the downed pilot. He was a prize beyond measure, an American aviator to be captured alive and paraded before cameras. "They're going to skin him alive if they get to him first," Private Cole said, his voice grim as he reloaded his saw with his good arm. Hayes looked back at her battered team. Corporal Brooks was stable, but entirely immobile. Specialist Ford had exhausted his medical supplies. Wright's heavy man-pack radio remained a useless brick without a clear line of sight to the orbital satellites. They had miraculously survived the ambush, but the mission parameters had just completely inverted. "We are not leaving him up there," Hayes stated, her voice slicing through the heavy, dust-choked air. "He put his multi-million-dollar bird in the dirt to save our lives. We owe him. LT, with all due respect, we don't have climbing gear," Wyatt interjected softly, ever the voice of tactical reason. "That wall is a 300-foot vertical free climb, and there's a small army of heavily armed fighters converging on the rim." "I don't need gear. I need suppressive fire," Hayes said, already unbuckling her heavy plate carrier. She systematically shed her primary assault rifle and excess magazines, keeping only her sidearm, a fixed-blade combat knife, and 3 fragmentation grenades hooked to her belt. Every single ounce of unnecessary weight had to go. Before joining the Navy, before she flew A-10s, Sarah Hayes had spent her teenage years free soloing the brutal, unforgiving rock formations of Zion National Park. She knew how to read stone. She knew how to find holds where absolutely none seemed to exist. "Wyatt, you have tactical command of the deck," Hayes ordered, her eyes locked on the cliff. "Consolidate whatever ammo you have left. If those fighters poke their heads over the rim to grab him, you shoot them in the face. Give me 15 minutes. Boss, you're really going to free climb that?" Ford asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm a SEAL. We do the impossible before breakfast," she replied with a fierce, tight smile. "Cover me." Hayes turned to the wall and pressed her bare hands against the cold, unyielding granite. She took a deep breath, slowing her racing heart rate, visualizing the impossible route upward. A tiny fissure here, a 1/4-inch lip of sandstone there. She pulled herself off the ground, instantly relying on nothing but fingertip grip and the friction of her desert boots. The ascent was agonizing. Her muscles, already exhausted from the brutal firefight, screamed in protest with every upward movement. Dust coated her sweaty palms, threatening to break her tenuous grip. Every time she dared to look down, the canyon floor seemed further away, a dizzying drop that guaranteed instant death if she slipped. 50 feet. 100 feet. Above her, the foreign chatter of the insurgents grew louder. They were closing in. Suddenly, a fighter wrapped in a dark scarf peered over the canyon rim, leveling an AK-47 directly at the dangling pilot. Crack! Wyatt's rifle barked from the canyon floor. The insurgent's head snapped back violently, his rifle tumbling down the cliff face and missing Hayes by mere inches. "Contact upper rim," Wyatt yelled from below. "Move, LT! They know he's there!" Hayes pushed her body beyond human limits, her fingers bleeding as she jammed them into sharp crevices. Pure adrenaline flooded her system, masking the tearing pain in her forearms. 250 feet. She could hear Henderson groaning now. He was conscious, frantically trying to unclip his harness with a clearly broken arm. "Johnny, stop moving!" Hayes hissed, clinging to a ledge just 10 feet below him. He looked down, his eyes wide with shock. "Sarah! What the hell? Taking you home, Captain." She drew her knife with her teeth, finding a solid foothold. "I'm cutting you loose. Grab onto me." "Are you insane? We'll both fall." "Trust me," Hayes roared. With a swift, brutal motion, she slashed the heavy nylon webbing. Gravity seized Henderson. He dropped, slamming into Hayes. The immense added weight tore her left hand from its hold. She screamed as her right shoulder dislocated with a sickening pop, taking the entire brunt of both their weights on a two-finger grip inside a shallow rock seam. "Grab the ledge," she commanded, her voice guttural. Using his good arm, Henderson reached over her and hauled himself onto the narrow outcropping. With his weight finally off her, Hayes swung her legs up, hooking her heel onto the rock, and collapsed onto the ledge beside him, gasping for air. "Radio," Hayes gasped, clutching her dislocated shoulder. Henderson fumbled out a PRC 112 survival transceiver. "VHF only," he winced. "That's all we need." Hayes keyed the mic with her good hand. "Any station, any station. This is Voodoo 1 Actual. We have a downed pilot and an isolated SEAL element. Request immediate armed extraction." Static reigned for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, a beautiful calm drawl broke through. "Voodoo 1 Actual. This is Stalker 6-4. Flight of 2MH-60 direct action. Penetrators. Keep your heads down. We are coming in hot." 2 heavily armed Night Stalker, Black Hawk helicopters crested the ridge, their miniguns spinning up to tear the advancing insurgent lines to shreds. As the first chopper carefully hovered to hoist the pair in a rescue basket, the second dropped into the gorge to extract the canyon floor team. Safe inside the cabin, Henderson smiled weakly through his pain. "Wraith, your JTAC skills are a little rough." Hayes leaned her head back against the metal bulkhead and let out a breathless laugh. "Next time, Captain, just bring the JD Ames." When all hope was lost in the canyon of death, survival demanded the impossible: a suicide dive by a fearless A-10 pilot, and an unbelievable free climb by a SEAL who refused to leave a brother behind. What did you think of Lieutenant Hayes's incredible leadership and Captain Henderson's insane stall-turn maneuver? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more adrenaline-pumping, real-life military stories.